All right, everybody. Today we're going to be going over The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. It's a pretty interesting book, and it basically outlines the goals and directives of anarcho-communism. So it was a very interesting read. I'm very glad I read it. It has a lot of interesting points that you could take away, and without further ado, let's get into the book. Chapter 1, we have Our Riches, and he's basically saying that humans in general are privy to everything that has ever been created because everything that has ever been created is the amalgamation of all the labor of all the people who came before us. Like, cities in the deserts would not exist if people did not irrigate those deserts and make it habitable. And this goes for every landscape. There would be no cities in the middle of forests because there would be trees. And then this even goes into the building of the cities themselves. There would be no sewer system if it were not for plumbers, like so on and so forth. So he says that his main conceit in this chapter is basically that everyone is entitled to everything because the people before us, it is a collection of their labor that has even made this world possible. Um, and he says that for this to be a reality, that private property must be done away with because private property is what separates the working man from the fruit of his forefathers' labors and the fruit of his own labor. It is his labor that creates the world and makes it a better place, and it is only through the means of private property that the monopolist and the capitalist is able to rob him of his dutiful right to housing, bread, clothes, because he dangles a wage in front of him. And basically, as a counterpoint to the wage system, he argues that free agreement should be used instead, where basically there's no government interference. It's just people coming together to work for a certain cause, be it baking bread, be it making clothes, be it making housing, be it providing water, be it making electricity, be it providing Wi-Fi. Anything, there will be a group of people who can come of their own volition to give that to society, basically. And when he talks about expropriation, he's not like a lot of other communists where they say, oh, we need to take all of the riches of the bourgeoisie and distribute them amongst the people equally. He's basically saying the source of the capitalists' riches is the poverty of his workers. The only reason he is able to make surplus value is because he owns all the capital and he lets the workmen who have nothing but their wage to offer, nothing but their labor to offer, he dangles a wage in front of them that barely allows them to live in exchange for working the capital that he doesn't want to work himself in order to generate him value based on the surplus value between the workers' labor and the machine cost itself. He says, oh, it's to offset the cost of buying the machine, when in reality he's making 3, 4, 5, 10, 100 times that as time goes on. It's just multiplying upon itself. And in regards to food, he says that basically in um, yeah, it talks about what I explained before, the slavery of the wage system, but he also talks about how if a revolution were to happen, that food should be, everyone should tally it up, but that should not be a permanent solution. The people should not rely on ration cards. It should be those free agreements that provide food to the people. We'll get into it later on how to provide like the actual agricultural foodstuffs to the people during this time, but basically he says that for a permanent solution, we must not rely on ration cards. Ration cards must be a temporary measure when it first gets going, but we must make sure that we have free agreements of people to provide bread, to provide salads, sushi, pasta, whatever the culture deems is necessary for people to eat on a daily basis. They need to be able to provide that with free agreements from people who have been working that field regularly before. Because if you give the people a free hand, then they'll just do it because that's what they have been doing, and they won't feel any obligation to receive a wage because they will be doing a necessary part of feeding the community and keeping people alive. In regards to dwellings and housing, he says that since a commune would not build with an eye to revenues, the buildings that it will be built for functionality and like housing as many people as possible to make sure that there are no homeless on the streets. And in regards to existing housing, which I didn't put the quote here, but I'm paraphrasing, so let me have this. Basically, he says that the buildings that can house multiple people will be refitted, and all these rooms that are being unfilled and all these houses that are not housing people, instead of being a part of a landlord's bid to make profit off of a people who need housing, they will be allowed to dwell in there. They will be allowed to have their own room. From going from homeless to having your own room is huge. So all these McMansions that have no people living in them but 30 rooms, he will be able to house the unhoused population in a relatively short amount of time, because the revolution will take to expropriating these dwellings as quickly as possible and refunctioning them to house multiple people. And clothing, I have a really simple quote. Every woman does not dote on velvet, nor does every man dream of sable linings. He's basically saying that clothing is more of a utilitarian tool, and people will choose what their position is known for or needs. Like, I'm pretty sure if we were to expropriate all the clothing, put all the clothing in a big pile, all the suits would be the last to go, because people need denim jeans for a hard days at work, and something light in cooler climates so they don't sweat their ass off, and something thicker in cold climates because it keeps them warm. The luxury and the fashion thing that comes with clothing is purely a capitalist invention. It's not part of people's actual desire. People are more material with their desire for clothing rather than fashion minded, until you get into the higher circles of society, which we seek to disband in the first place. Ways and means. This is just basically restating what he stated earlier, but driving it home, that it is a necessity of the capitalist to keep his workmen poor, just as the Lord kept his peasants poor, in order to gift them with gifts of like tools to work the land, even though it's his land that they're working and it's his money that they're making with their crops. So it's a necessity that they become poor so that they are willing to become the beast of burden of society. They're willing to do all the labor that's necessary to make this society run. The need for luxury. He argues that luxury should be not but voluntary groups of men. He gives an example of geology, that if everyone who was interested in geology just came together on their off time, they would be able to basically do the work of a geologist more efficiently, just because they have more people working on it. So it's, instead of relying on paid departments of the state or corporations or what have you, people who are interested in the subject just join voluntary groups, and these groups being not only, not only people who do it as a job, but people who are passionate about it, people who are willing to do the research, and enormous amount of them, because they're no longer complied to work for a wage for this certain position. Leaps and bounds will be made in these respective fields because people are just doing it of their own volition. On agreeable work, he basically says that the most efficient factories are ones that have been around for like ages, but it's not because they've had time to develop their equipment necessarily. It's that they have made the work agreeable. They have made even working in a steel mill agreeable, because they have found ways to expedite the process, to make it more agreeable. And he says that if it were a question of not profits but people's well-being, every factory would be organized like this. Instead of one or two, it would be all of them, because we wouldn't have to worry about, oh, these, run-of-the-mill factories are being staffed by child workers, so they could cut costs, and using shoddy equipment so they could cut even more cost and rake in more profit. It would be, no, these are steel mill workers who have trained for this for their whole lives, who need an agreeable workspace in order to produce the most efficient product. He basically argues that profit incentive is far less a determinant of a good workspace and a reliable, a functional workspace, rather than groups of men who have unionized, organized to make the work more agreeable because they realize what is needed for their work because they are the ones working. And in Chapter 11, Free Agreement, he says that it's the state that is the problem. The state crafts concessions and guarantees to the capitalist in order to keep the capitalist on the politician's side. Just like in Russia, where they sent soldiers against the railwaymen on strike, if it were a free agreement, the state would actually oppose it. Because for the state in a war, let us take the Red Cross for example. The state's ideal doctor is one who is salaried by the state because he will make sure that the state soldiers will go back into the fight and kill more of the enemy. The state does not care for the Red Cross and its hygienic hospitals because the nurses are not functionaries of the state. They are not bound to a state paycheck. They are not bound to a state wage. So they are able to actually do their job better because they are organized upon the basis of free agreement rather than wage slavery by the state. Now we're going to talk about objections. One of the main objections to this style of anarcho-communism is that people won't work if they're not compelled. And to counterpoint this, he brings up slavery in the United States and serfdom in Russia. And after the slaves were freed in America, black people were still working in the fields. Sharecropping was still a thing, and they produced more, even though they were getting paid now. And granted, there is a lot of bad things that happen with sharecropping, but because they were free to do as they will and work for their own wage instead of working just for the enrichment of their master, he did better work. And the same goes with the Russian peasant. He worked with an eagerness after he was able to celebrate Sundays and be with his family because he was not tied to basically another system of slavery in another part of the country, another part of the world, my bad. So without compulsion, the masses will work, and contrary to popular belief, they will work harder than if they were compelled to do it for no wage, a wage, or what have you. Basically, when you're organized upon free agreement, when you're doing it because you can rather than because you must, you do better work. And something in this objection part that really kind of caught my attention was this quote on page 135 where he says, "Should an authoritarian socialist society ever succeed in establishing itself, it could not last. General discontent would soon force it to break up." And the foresight of this man is prodigious, because that is pretty much word for word what happened to the Soviet Union, which established itself in Kropotkin's country of Russia. And basically this authoritarian socialist society disgruntled the masses to the point where no matter how many tanks or guns they had, the people who were working it just could not bear the weight of this authoritarian government on top of them. So a very valid point right there that goes to show his eye to the future. In regards to this authoritarian capitalist position, authoritarian communist position, he says that the collectivist wages system basically doesn't work. If you are a commune only as far as regards to production, and every work minute, work hour was calculated, and your work minutes were worth less than someone who had a higher education, it's basically doing the same thing as capitalism all over again. You cannot make a distinction between collective and private property. All property must be for all people. Because if you start counting labor hours and labor minutes, you've missed the whole plot. Even if everyone's getting the same, it doesn't work to break down the capitalist system. It only reinforces those values that were put into place in society because of capitalism. And basically, to further elaborate on this point. He says that we are capable of providing for all of our people, but what hinders this is profit incentive rather than the work being put in. Everyone, if they work, could produce everything that they need. But what's hindering this from going forward is the fact that people are producing knickknacks, baubles, and luxuries that they don't really need because it is profitable. You have people working on cash crops producing tobacco when that same field, those same acres, could be used to produce food that people need in one country or another or across the world. But instead they're producing a useless good that only serves to gain the capitalist profits. And to further go on this point, he says that the division of labor basically labels a man for life, and it destroys their love for work, and it alienates them from their work because all they do is make nails, for example. And in this society, we claim to have gone past feudalism, but the diploma, the degree, serves as another stand-in for a lord. Basically, you have labeled yourself as being able to do some specific division of labor, and that puts you above a man who has not the opportunity to gain the same piece of paper that you have, even though he could be quite as efficient as you if properly trained. That training seeks to label and stamp men above other men so they can lord their power over the common workman. And he says to do away with the division of labor entirely because it alienates people from their work and it destroys the love of work and the capacity for invention. Decentralization of industry. Basically, it's always good to combine agriculture with every possible variety of factories. It doesn't really make sense to export wheat and import flour, and the only reason that became an economic go-to is because of mercantilism and the fact that we wanted to keep colonies dependent on their father nation, so we would have them export raw goods and import finished goods that we made in industries in the father nation. And agriculture, last chapter, 17, basically, to sum it all up, market gardening. Greenhouses can produce whatever any time of year, and they're far more efficient, and they can be packed into very small space to the point where cities can become self-sufficient. And it's important to press this forward. I mean, in his time, it hadn't been pressed forward, but nowadays, everything is grown in a greenhouse because we get everything year-round all the time. So obviously, he was onto something with agriculture, because it doesn't matter the season. You could always produce whatever you need, whatever vegetable crops or salad crops or fruits inside of a market garden, inside of a greenhouse, rather than just plowing the field. He says that this extensive agriculture is less effective than market gardening and intensive agriculture, where you're working a specific plot of land and trying to not just take the soil of all its nutrients, but replenish it, and basically a more sustainable form of agriculture. Thank you very much, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and have a wonderful rest of your day. This has been West Easy with Conquest of Bread Summary, signing out.